I've chosen as a theme and a text. Well, let me begin with the theme. The theme that I've chosen for this evening is Disciples of Mercy. And the text that I've chosen is verse 16 from Genesis 19. That verse says, "But he lingered, so the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and left him outside the city." Disciples of Mercy. I am a lover of Shakespeare. And as I was in high school, what seemed like many, many years ago, we, of course, had to do a number of Shakespearean plays. And one of the plays that we had to study in 4th form was the play The Merchant of Venice. And so this evening, I want to begin my time of sharing with you by offering a summary of that Shakespearean play, just in case it is no longer in the curriculum, or just in case you belong to those who just hated literature and anything Shakespearean. And so there's some slides. And so the Shakespearean play, The Merchant of Venice, oh good, it's in front of me, so I don't need to turn around, included 3 main characters: Shylock, Portia, and Antonio. Next slide. Oh God, that needs to be a bigger. We're all disabled. So this is just a summary of the plot of the play. I have to read this one here, Samuel, because I have passed 50. So, once you pass 50. So Bassanio, who is the guy on the left, he asks Antonio for a loan, but Antonio can't give him one. Moving along. Portia has a friend whose name is Nerissa. And of course, Nerissa and Portia are discussing Bassanio. Antonio, though, gets a loan from Shylock, so don't lose me now, okay, this is, soap opera. So Antonio gets a loan from Shylock, and if you keep coming down, Portia has a number of suitors, and the first suitor that Shakespeare highlights is the Prince of Morocco, and he chooses the wrong basket, and so he cannot marry Portia. Jessica, who is Shylock's daughter, dresses and runs away with Shylock's jewels. Bassanio and Portia get engaged. Shylock has Antonio arrested and demands his pound of flesh, which was the clause in the loan agreement. Portia then disguises herself as a lawyer, saves Antonio, and then Portia reveals herself and forgives Bassanio for giving away her ring. So just in case you missed that, go to the next slide and we'll unpack it scene by scene. So scene 1. Antonio is sad that all of his money is tied up in ships at sea. All right? Bassanio, the guy to the left, he goes now and borrows money from the guy on the right, Antonio. Antonio is sorry that he cannot lend Bassanio the money. Because why? The money is tied up in investment. Okay, next slide. Now, Portia has a really good friendship in Nerissa. That's BFF. Do they still use that term? Okay, cool. Right. And so Portia's father dies and leaves all of these conditions as to how she can get married. And so as a BFF, is trying to figure out what is she going to do about this marriage thing and so on. Nerissa, of course, tells Portia that Bassanio is it, he's the guy for you, and he could be a good potential husband. Then the Moroccan fella comes, and all of these guys are lined up trying to get Portia's hand, all right? You have to step back. This is Shakespeare days. This is how, society was structured. Keep going, next slide. And then Jessica and Lorenzo plot an escape. The Prince of Morocco, off to the left, he loses his casket challenge because he chooses gold. Shakespeare has another wonderful monologue, all that glitters is not gold. I'm sure you've heard that term before. Jessica disguises herself as a boy, and then she runs away with Shylock, who's her father's jewels. All right, keep going. So Lorenzo and Jessica escape. They live happily ever after. The Prince of Aragon, he also loses the casket challenge. Antonio really wants to help his good friend Bassanio, and so he is made bankrupt because he loses all of his investments in the ship. And so he goes to Shylock, and he borrows the money from Shylock. But Shylock says, I give you the money for 1 pound of flesh. Next thing. Next slide. So, finally, the good boy Bassanio, he chooses the right casket, and so he gets to marry Portia. They are engaged, and Portia then offers to pay Bassanio's debt. Keep going. Portia then decides to disguise herself as a lawyer because she's trying to save Antonio, because you remember Antonio owes money to? Come on, man, stay with me. And, all right. Antonio owes money to Shylock. Go ahead. So Bassanio is forced to give the ring after to the lawyer for defending him. Portia then reveals that she is in fact the lawyer, and then Portia also goes now to Antonio and tells him that all of his ships are safe and he really did not lose his investment. So now, Sammy, if you could go back to Portia. So that is a summary of the whole of the Shakespearean play. If you did not do it in high school, no need to worry, you got it covered. There's so many interesting and thought-provoking monologues in the play, but the one that I wish to focus on today is the monologue that Portia offers in Act 4, Scene 1. And this is Portia's monologue. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above the sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. An earthly power doth then show likest gods when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. I have spoken thus much to mitigate the justice of thy plea, which if thou follow, the strict court of Venice must needs give sentence against the merchant there. And so today, as part of your ongoing series of children's Bible stories for radical discipleship, as we revisit this story in Genesis 19, I'm inviting you to do so through the lens of this Shakespearean play, and to do so particularly through the theme of mercy, as being disciples of mercy. I need not mention to you how this story of Sodom and Gomorrah has been told and retold with an emphasis on the destruction of the city because of its sexual immorality. I will not, though, dwell on that today. Neither will I dwell on those who have countered that narrative by emphasizing that the destruction was due to the lack of hospitality that was rampant throughout the city. My focus is not on the status of the moral state of affairs in the city at the time of its destruction. I will not attempt to understand why God chose to act the way God did in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Rather, I want to pick up an element of your series that I found rather intriguing as Seth shared with me the topic, and that is the commitment that you as a congregation are seeking to make to practice radical discipleship. Given then your desire, I submit to you today that under God, the retelling of the story in Genesis 19 calls all of us as a community to indeed see ourselves, yes, as radical disciples, but might I add, radical disciples of mercy. I invite us then to see that mercy is not an afterthought in this story. It is very much a bold headline. And might we think that mercy is as much a headline as judgment? And while probably for many of us as children, we would have heard this story and it would have been told to us with a repeated emphasis on God's judgment, what if we now were to see it as a story that emphasizes God's mercy? When Portia speaks, she utters these words referring to mercy. It is an attribute to God himself. An earthly power doth then show like as God's when mercy seasons justice. That's Shakespeare's words. But in modern English, Portia would have us hear, it is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute of God himself. An earthly power most closely resembles God's power when justice is guided by mercy. But what is mercy as an attribute of God? The Hebrew word for mercy finds its root in the same word for womb. It therefore addresses compassion and tenderness. And where then do we see the tenderness or the compassion of God in this story? And if it is there, if the tenderness and the compassion of God is in this story, why is it that it appears to be almost non-existent in our telling of it? Or for that matter, simply made a footnote. And yet we see the mercy of God being demonstrated in the acts of the messengers of God who went into the city to bring Lot out and his family. We see the mercy of God in God choosing through the messengers not to destroy the city of Zoar. So Zoar as a city receives God's mercy. We see the mercy and the compassion of God as the messengers of God negotiates with Lot throughout the night and into the morning. God's mercy, I ask us then to see, is not a mere afterthought or a small matter, but it is very much a headline. But Portia's monologue does not only reflect on the mercy of God as she speaks to Shylock the Jew. She also addresses the importance of mercy as an attribute for us human beings. In her modern day translation, Portia's words in the monologue would say, "None of us would be saved if we depended on justice alone. We pray for mercy, and in seeking it ourselves, we learn to be merciful." Let me say that again. In seeking mercy ourselves, we learn to be merciful. The words that Shakespeare puts in Portia's mouth certainly mirrors that of Jesus himself in Matthew 5 and verse 7, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." And for us as human beings, should we desire to see a human example of mercy, where else do we see that ultimate divine example of mercy than in the face of Jesus the Christ? For throughout his earthly ministry, Jesus embodied and demonstrated what God's mercy looks like. There are more than enough stories of Jesus' encounter with the people of his day, the earthly Jesus walking on this earth, that captures, I believe, very clearly the incarnation of mercy. One passage that comes to mind is St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 9, and we hear these words in verses 36 to 38. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Dear friends, herein we see too that if in our discipleship we ought to be laborers as Christ has called us to be, we need to do so with mercy and with compassion at the very core of our discipleship. As a community of believers, we ought to be reminded that we have been called to live out the mandate of Colossians 3 and verse 12, which says, "Therefore, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourself with compassion, with kindness, with humility, meekness, and patience." There is no denying that we live in a world that is merciless and lacking in compassion. And I am not referring to the guy sitting in the White House only. I am not simply referring to the words of a bishop who in a sermon asks the president to be merciful, because what we saw unfolding in our television screens unfolds not only there, but in corporate offices. It unfolds in classrooms. It unfolds in families where there are those who are pleading, "Be merciful. Be merciful because it is within your power to exercise mercy." So then we're here in Sydney, in Australia, in our neighborhoods among us, are those places where mercy needs to be experienced and become real. Who are those among us who are most in need of mercy and to have mercy shown to them? While you and I pray for justice, might we not pray any less for mercy? Mercy where there is conflict, mercy where there is hunger, mercy where people's rights are being denied, mercy where there is war, mercy for those who have been trampled and pushed aside. What is dangerous in life is that sometimes those who feel as though mercy has not been granted to them with hardened, callous hearts can oftentimes fail to be merciful. And that ought not to be our story. And even if for some reason we feel as though mercy has not been given to us, radical discipleship invites us all to make sure we do not give what we have received that did not seem to be merciful. Your call then to radical discipleship is for all of us as a community to be disciples of mercy. While we seek mercy, today I invite us to therefore answer God's call for radical discipleship so that we follow and serve a God whose mercy and grace follows us each day of our lives. And here's why. All of us sitting in this place at this hour have all been recipients of God's mercy. Let me say that again. Each of us sitting here tonight has been the recipient of God's mercy. Having received God's mercy, let us now go into the world and become radical disciples of that same mercy. Amen.